The history of Islam in the Philippines is one of the greatest stories untold to the Muslim world. It is a tale of heroic kings that fought to their death and tragic betrayals that sold out entire nations to slavery. It's a story of a united struggle against three of the greatest empires of the world and a resistance that lasted for more than 400 years. And while this story may take place in the furthest corners of the East, in order to explain it, we must first arrive at the shores of Iberia, the edge of Europe, the part of the known world furthest to the west. In the year 711, the Muslims first began the conquest of Spain and Portugal, taking control of nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula in only a few short years. From there, they began a campaign beyond the Pyrenees Mountains, reaching deep into French territory before finally being defeated and pushed back. And ever since then, the Christian kingdoms of Europe sought to retake Iberia from the Muslims, a people from North Africa and Arabia who had once been weak and disorganized. But with the revelation of Islam, they had now united under one flag and they dominated the lands, striking fear into the heart of the Christian kingdoms who saw this new enemy and who called them the Moors. And so over the next 800 years, the Christians slowly managed to retake the lost territory, sometimes allying with the Muslims against other Muslims, dividing them and conquering, until eventually the last city-state at the very edge of the peninsula finally fell to the hands of these crusaders, and the last of the Moorish kings was forced into exile. And for every Moor and every Muslim left behind in Iberia, the Catholic monarchs began the long process of forcefully converting each and every one of them to Christianity, or else having them removed from the land or executed. And now they found themselves in a difficult spot. With huge swaths of the population now gone, and them unable to do trade with the rest of the Muslim lands, Spain and Portugal fell into a deep economic crisis. And their solution was to invest in new shipbuilding technologies and to invent tools that would allow them to navigate across the oceans using the stars. And so the kingdoms of Spain and Portugal began the age of exploration, discovering new lands across the oceans in an effort to build new trade routes and enrich themselves. And soon they reached the Caribbean and then the Americas, and they conquered lands and enslaved the populations. But they knew that the world was round, and they knew that if they kept going, they would eventually reach India and China, going around the Muslim lands, circumnavigating the globe. And for the Crusaders among them, some of them dreamed of building Christian empires in both the West and the East, surrounding the Muslims on all sides in order to eventually take back Jerusalem for Christendom. And so, in 1519, the Magellan expedition was sent from Spain in order to circumnavigate the world. They took off from Spain and headed south across the Atlantic Ocean, going around Brazil and Argentina and Chile, before reaching the Pacific Ocean on the other side. There, they wandered the seas for nearly 4 months, with many of their crew starving to death. And then, there they saw it. They had spotted land arriving on the island of Guam. The last of the world's oceans had been sailed. This would be a new beginning for Christendom. There they found a people who had never received revelation, a people who knew nothing about God. But to their horror, as they sailed from Guam to the Philippines and they arrived on its shores, here they found a people bowed down and prostrated in prayer and who called out to Allah as the one true God. They had sailed across the world's oceans to lands where no man had ever been before. But here there were men, and seeing them as the nation that had once conquered Iberia, they called them the Moros, naming them after the Moors, as they soon realized that somehow the Muslims had gotten here first.
And by the way, if you want to support the channel and help me pay my editors, you can sign up for my
Spain and Portugal in the west, sailors and merchants from Arabia and Persia and Somalia had begun crossing the Indian Ocean in search of new trade routes to connect. From here, the Muslims arrived in the Malay archipelago, a series of islands that are shared between Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And from there, they began setting up small communities and intermarrying with and doing trade with the locals. And over the next few hundred years, Islam slowly spread in the land, with some individuals and some families here and there converting. But things really began to take off in 1230 when the king of Perlac became the first king to accept Islam. And because the royal families on all these islands were all intermarried and connected, soon a domino effect occurred. Royalty intermarried with royalty, and princes and princesses converted to Islam through their wives and husbands. Kingdom by kingdom, the royal families of Samudara Pasay and Aceh and Malacca and Kedah and Johor and Ternate and Tidore and Damak and Cirebon and Banten and Mataram and Goa and so on and so on. All of these kingdoms became sultanates, and their kings and rajas became sultans. Then there were the 3 kingdoms in the northeast where Malaysia and Indonesia and the Philippines divided. And these were the kingdoms of Brunei and Sulu and Maguindanao, each of which had kings that had converted to Islam either through marriage or through da'wah of a Muslim merchant who had preached Islam to the people. And by the time the Spanish had arrived, Islam was already spreading across the islands to the north. You see, the Philippines can be divided into 3 main areas, with Mindanao in the south, Visayas in the middle, and Luzon in the north. And when the Spanish arrived and started their war of colonization, they began with Visayas, enslaving the people there and forcing them to convert to Christianity. Soon after, they began conquering further to the north, where Muslims ruled the kingdoms of Tondo and Manila, city-states that were supported by the Sultan of Brunei. And in 1570, the Muslim rulers fought their first battle against the invading Christians. It was a quick and sudden siege of Manila, and when the natives realized they were unlikely to win, they fled on boats to Tondo, burning down their own city to prevent the Spanish from using it. Realizing that this was a tactical retreat, the Spanish themselves also withdrew, deciding to return back the next year with their full fleet. And when they returned, a final battle decided their fate. But the overwhelming power of the Spanish Navy crushed the small forces of Manila and then Tondo, and soon the Spanish declared Manila as the capital state of the Spanish East Indies. Over the next few years, rebellions from natives and pirates from China threatened Spanish control over Manila, but each time the attacks were defended and the threats were put down. Eventually, the Spanish managed to stabilize their position in the north, far away from the Muslim strongholds in the south. But just like in Spain, where they were still purging Muslims from their lands, here too they sought to Christianize the entire country. And that was their real goal. To quote the Governor General Francisco de Sande, the Moros from Borneo preached the doctrine of Muhammad, converting all the Moros of the islands. And so the Spanish began preparing for war with the Muslims of the Philippines. And in response, the Muslims began their own call for jihad. The first major battle broke out in 1578 when the Spanish began landing their ships in Jolo in Mindanao. But the Muslim sultanates of Brunei and Sulu and Mindanao remained united and managed to push back the Spanish attacks from their lands. With the Spanish now shown to be weak, having been unsuccessful in their attack, a new conspiracy was being planned from within their territories, and a hidden Muslim threat began to emerge. You see, under the Spanish, the Muslim families from Manila and Tondo were forced to convert to Christianity. And one of the princes of Tondo was Raja Muhammad Zahir ad-Din, who was then given the Christian name Don Agustin de Legazpi. Not happy with this and seeing the Spanish weakness, he began secretly requesting weapons and warriors from his connections in Japan and from the Sultan of Brunei. Word soon spread among the old royalty, who were all in agreement that the Spanish needed to go, and many of the old princes took part in the planning. But eventually the news reached one of them, who turned out to be a spy, betraying their plans to the Spanish. And so in 1588, Raja Muhammad was hanged and beheaded, and his head was placed in an iron cage and paraded throughout the streets. The conspiracy had failed, and Spanish rule continued. For the next 50 years, the Spanish and the Muslims vied for influence over the middle islands of Visayas. Forts were built, raids were conducted, and pirates attacked and pillaged each other's ships. But soon that all changed when in 1637, the Spanish launched their second major offensive, landing in Lanao and quickly defeating the disunited tribes. But what they hadn't counted on was the arrival of one man, the legend of the Philippines. A man who stands tall as one of the great heroes of the nation for both Muslims and non-Muslims, and what he did next would determine the fate of Mindanao for generations to come. Muhammad Kudarat, Sultan of Maguindanao, rushed to Lake Lanao, calling for the chieftains and all the tribes from the surrounding lands. He called upon them to put their differences aside and to unite against the Spanish, to not let themselves become enslaved and fall to this existential crisis. You men of the lake, forgetting your ancient liberty, you've submitted to the Castilians. You are selling yourselves into slavery. Look at the regions that have already submitted to them. How abject is their misery, to which their people are now reduced. Be men. Let me aid you in resistance. All the strength of my sultanate, I promise you, shall be used in your defense. And there they agreed, and they sacrificed their harvests for that year, and they prepared their defenses, and they repelled every attack the Spanish launched at them. Battle after battle, siege after siege, Muhammad Kudarat led his people to victory against the Spanish. And now a united front, both Muslim and non-Muslim, fought side by side under him. And by 1640, the Spanish had been completely repelled from Lanao. And soon after, they began launching attacks against the Spanish in the North Territories, threatening to liberate the entire country from colonization. And during all that time, while all this was happening, Muhammad Kudarat was building alliances with the Dutch and with the Chinese. And the Chinese even came to his aid, later threatening to invade the Philippines, forcing the Spanish to move their navies north, forcing them to defend against a whole new threat. And from that, they lost their position, no longer able to attack the Muslims in the south. Muhammad Kudarat was a fierce warrior, and a cunning diplomat, and a just ruler who kept his promises and was fair to his people. Under his leadership, the Sultanate of Maguindanao became a hub of trade and culture and Islamic scholarship. And even though Maguindanao did eventually recognize Spanish sovereignty in 1851, some 200 years later, because of him, the Spanish were never really able to conquer and subjugate the people of Mindanao. For over 300 years, these people had defended their lands against Spanish colonization, outlasting even the fall of the Spanish Empire. But then, towards the end of the 1800s, in its place came a new threat, one that would soon prove itself to be an even bigger danger. In 1898, the Spanish Empire had lost virtually all of its past colonies, with only Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines remaining under its control. But with recent modernization of the American Navy and a revolt taking place in Cuba, it was only a matter of time before the US stepped in and took Cuba and Puerto Rico for itself. All it needed was a catalyst. Well, that soon came when in 1898, the USS Maine, a battleship with a crew of 355 men, was sent to dock along the coast of Havana. There, at some point in the middle of the night, while all the crew was asleep, suddenly A huge explosion tore the ship apart, killing 261 sailors and sinking the ship to the bottom of the sea. Immediately, American newspapers began running stories that the Spanish had bombed the ship, blaming them for the incident. They began printing slogans like "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," beating the drums of war. And although the cause of the explosion remains a mystery even till today, the US took advantage of this sudden change in public opinion, and they launched an attack on the Spanish Empire, capturing Guam and Puerto Rico and Cuba before setting their sights on the last and the biggest of their colonies, the Philippines. Spain was eventually forced to sell the Philippines to the US in 1898 for some $20 million. But in reality, the Philippines wasn't really Spain's to sell anyway. Immediately, a war of resistance began, and the entire country erupted against the US. Recognizing that the Muslim sultanates in the south were the biggest threat to American control, the US decided to offer a peace agreement with them, stating that they would leave the Muslims alone and allow them to rule themselves autonomously as long as they didn't get involved in the Philippine War of Resistance. The Muslims agreed and the treaty was signed, and so the US left them alone and focused on the islands in the middle and the north, eventually taking Manila as the new capital. After 3 years of fighting, the Philippines' resistance had lost, and now the US decided to turn its attention to the remaining Muslim sultanates in the south, tearing up their treaty in 1904, setting up 2 military bases in Jolo and Zamboanga, the heart of the Muslim lands. Now the Americans had come for the Muslims, and now the Muslims would put up a fight. For the next 10 years, Muslim uprisings and rebellions were sparked all around the southern islands, the first of which was the Hassan uprising, led by the youngest prince of Jolo, who attacked the American soldiers who were occupying the island. This guerrilla war lasted a few months, but was finally put down when Prince Hassan himself was killed in battle. He was shot 33 times in the body, but still kept charging. And just when he was about to hack an American soldier with his blade, it took a 34th bullet to finally stop him, hitting him in the head. It was a brutal and bloody war, with waves of rebellion after rebellion and massacre after massacre. Some 10 to 15,000 Muslims were killed in the fighting. Many of them were civilians. But by 1913, the US managed to put all of them down and forced the Muslims into submission. The Muslim governments were then dissolved, and Christian Filipinos were brought in to dilute the Muslim populations. And here, the Muslims remained, along with the rest of the Philippines, under the control of the US as an American colony until once again the drums of war began beating, and a new colonial power would rise. This would become the third and final colonizer of the Philippines, a new threat to the Muslims, which would soon bring them to a total of over 400 years of resistance. And that threat came in 1941, when the Japanese launched their attack on Pearl Harbor.
On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards.
Now, well into World War II, the Japanese immediately followed up their attack by launching a campaign against the US in the Philippines, taking control of the country within only a few months. Soon after, the Muslims in the south began their resistance, organizing into guerrilla armies and swearing oaths on the Quran that even though many of them only had blades and machetes, they would not flee from the enemy, but rather they would die on the battlefield if necessary. And they first showed their fierceness in battle when in 1942 they ambushed the Japanese at Lake Lanao, killing 130 of their soldiers. The Japanese soon realized who they were dealing with, and they would always try to avoid Muslim areas, fearing that they could be attacked at any moment. Still, the Muslims managed to find them and attack them almost constantly for the next 2 years. They disrupted their supply lines, assassinated collaborators, and launched constant raids against them. As an example of this, it was said that on the island of Jolo, 97% of Japanese soldiers occupying there would eventually be killed by Muslim fighters. Only a few Japanese soldiers got out alive. Soon after, the US returned to the Philippines, and once again they made a peace agreement with the Muslims, allying with them to take down the Japanese Empire. It was now 1945, and the US had just dropped 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing up to 250,000 people in an instant, most of which were civilians. Having seen a level of destruction no human being at the time had even thought possible, the Japanese were forced to surrender. The days of old empires were gone, and a new world order was being developed, one that relied on the US maintaining control of the world's oceans. And now, under the new system, the Philippines was made into an independent country, consolidating its territories, including the lands of the old sultanates of Sulu and Mindanao. And while many of the Muslims were not content with a new centralized government in Manila ruling over them, the forced Christianization of the Philippines under the Spanish and later the Americans had made the Muslims a minority in their own lands. And after more than 400 years of fighting, the Muslims in the Philippines no longer had functional sultans or independent governments. The Muslims were now assimilated into the new Philippine state. And while there were some concessions made to the Muslims to allow them to keep some of their own laws and customs, exemptions that were given only to the Muslim populations, discrimination and tensions still exist in the Philippines today. And unfortunately, in recent times, there have even been some extremist groups trying to take advantage of these tensions for their own political goals, further fueling these tensions. This was the history of Islam in the Philippines, one of the historic lands of great Muslim sultans and empires, leaders of a great resistance against oppression and against occupation for over 400 years, a people of undeniable will and spirit and bravery, and a history and a culture whose richness is unlike anywhere else in this world. Today, the Muslims of the Philippines are a living proof of the peaceful spread of Islam around the world long before the Europeans began their age of exploration, and to the strength and the unity of the Muslim peoples in the face of oppression.